25 horrible things about the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 that almost wiped out Europe in the Middle Ages. Life during the Middle Ages was not easy. Social divisions, precariousness and deprivation affected a large part of the population. Of course, as in any period of history, social class, wealth and status also influenced the quality of life of each person. However, there were great tragedies that did not distinguish social class. This was the case with the Great Famine of the 14th century. A devastating event that lasted from 1315 to 1317. Famine, despair, disease, death and devastation were some of the consequences of this famine that affected a large part of northern Europe. It is one of the clearest examples of the impact of climate change on people's daily lives. In this video, we will tell you the story of the Great Medieval Famine, its causes, consequences and how it marked the European medieval culture for several centuries. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to keep up to date with our updates. Number 1. Famines were relatively frequent in medieval Europe due to the living conditions of the time. Famines used to occur frequently only in the Kingdom of France. Local famines were recorded on numerous occasions during the 14th century. Between 1304 and 1310, between 1330 and 1334, between 1349 and 1351, again between 1358 and 1360, then in 1371, and between 1374 and 1375 and finally, in 1390. The Kingdom of England had 3 localized famines in its territory during the same century. In the years 1321, 1351 and 1369. For the vast majority of the population, life was short and full of hardship. According to the records of the English royal family, life expectancy at birth was 35.28 years. This refers to a family with enormous privileges and living conditions. Number 2, the Great Famine was preceded by a demographic explosion. Despite medieval hardships and living conditions, the European population grew considerably between the 10th and 13th centuries. Also remembered as the medieval warm period, when abnormally hot temperatures were recorded for the region. During those 3 centuries, the European population grew to levels so high that they could not be reached again until the 19th century. In fact, there are parts of the French countryside today that are still not as populated as they were in the 14th century. Number 3, it all started with heavy rains in the spring of 1315. It started a period of particularly heavy rains in most of the European territory. The region was coming from the warm period and the constant and persistent rains lowered the temperatures. It was a drastic change in climate due to the high levels of precipitation. Landslides and severe flooding occurred especially in the coastal areas. It is estimated that more than 2,000 acres in the Sussex region were submerged. In the port of Dunwich, one of the 5 most important ports in England, the rains caused the destruction of 269 houses, 10 buildings and 2 stores. Number 4, agricultural production was reduced due to the rains that began in 1315 and remained persistent in 1316 and 1317. The constant water saturated the soils, especially affecting agricultural land. The floods affected crops and worsened the quality of the soils, making it difficult to plant new crops. The humidity affected the grains that did not ripen. It is estimated that during the 13th century, 10 bushels of wheat were harvested for every bushel sown. During the first years of the famine, this production was reduced, barely a third or at most half of that level of production was harvested. The same happened with other agricultural products. Number 5, salts caused crop failure and the inability to produce more food, causing severe shortages. The lack of salt, a key commodity for preserving food, exacerbated the crisis. At the time, salt was the only way to preserve meat. But the rains also affected its production. With such a humid climate, evaporating the brine was difficult. Therefore, there was less salt available. The population could not prepare for the consequences of this shortage, for without salt, the meat would decompose because it could not be preserved. Number 6, social division marked the consequences of the famine. Although it did affect the entire population, the crisis was not the same for everyone. To begin with, the upper classes and the nobility already had a head start. In the large residences there was more food stored for consumption, and they could pay more for scarce food. In addition, emergency grain stores were reserved exclusively for royalty, lords, feu nobles, wealthy merchants and the church. The general population, which had grown in recent centuries, was unprotected in the face of reduced food production. It was inevitable that a good part would starve to death. Number 7, food prices rose sharply due to scarcity and increased demand. People were willing to pay much more for food. The price of salt, the value of which was explained previously, increased from 30 to 40 shillings in the medieval reign of the rains. The cost of wheat increased 320%, making it a luxury only available to a very small and privileged proportion of the population. Number 8, the famine spread over a wide territory. The famine of 1313 and 1317 was notable for its extent. Most famines were localized in very specific regions of Europe. Although it was still a serious and painful problem, its scope was limited. The Great Famine, on the other hand, was the largest and most widespread event of its kind, at least on record, in the Middle Ages. Climatic changes, their effects on agriculture and the economy, affected several kingdoms. For almost 3 years, famine occurred in the territories of Ireland, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, much of Germany and some regions of Poland, Austria, and Scandinavia. An area of 10,360 square kilometers, in which about 30 million people lived. To get an idea, the area affected is larger than the entire continental United States, Canada or even China. Number 9, entire villages were abandoned, especially in rural areas with peasant populations. The drop in production and lack of opportunities led many to move to more urban areas. Entire villages on the coasts of the Netherlands also disappeared due to flooding. Farmers sought employment or food in the cities. Number 10, animals also suffered from starvation due to the lack of available food. The weather also affected the health of animals such as sheep, cows and horses. Entire herds were weak, sick or dead. The livestock situation was catastrophic in some regions. Number 11. The upper classes were affected economically. Although the privileged population had greater access and economic capacity to buy food, the famine still affected their living conditions. Landowners, essentially monarchs, nobles and the church, saw their properties lose value. Their profits practically disappeared and territories began to be sold at ridiculously low prices. Many took out large loans to maintain their property and food. Smaller monasteries and convents were closed. Even large institutions such as the Priory of Canterbury Cathedral sold religious relics to try to raise money. Some measures were implemented to mitigate the crisis. Although it was impossible to avoid the deaths, the local authorities of the different territories took some measures to try to stop them. Or at least lessen the impact of the famine. Among other things, they ordered to control the prices of some foodstuffs and sought to import products from southern Europe. Also during the period, many hospitals and hospices were opened, most likely to care for those weakened and sickened by the famine. Number 13. The wars worsened the situation. The various conflicts occurring in medieval Europe deepened the famine suffered by the population. In 1314 there were clashes between Scotland and England that also developed in Ireland. Germany was the scene of a war between Ludwig of Bavaria and Frederick of Austria. For its part, the Kingdom of France was in conflict with Flanders, a region of today's Netherlands. Scandinavia and Wales also had revolts and conflicts. All this demanded food and resources for the soldiers, which further reduced the supply of scarce food. Battles left serious damage to villages that were also victims of looting and destruction. Governments obliged to feed their soldiers went to the expense of taxes and the seizure of products for the troops. All this resulted in an environment of poverty and misery. Number 14. The famine caused many deaths. Although it is impossible to know the exact number of deaths due to the Great European Famine, estimates indicate that between 5 and 12% of the population died due to this crisis. If the life expectancy of the English royal family was 35 years, in the 13th century during the Great Famine this figure was reduced to 29 years. Number 15. It affected the legitimacy of the Catholic Church. Almost all prehistoric human societies attributed natural phenomena and disasters to some divine entity or deity. Depending on their religion, in most cases these extreme phenomena were considered divine punishments during the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church was one of the strongest and most powerful institutions when the famine began. Many turned to prayer to ask God for forgiveness. No amount of praying was enough. The crisis only worsened, leading much of the population to a crisis of faith, which in turn was reflected in a loss of legitimacy for the Church. It is believed that this served as the basis for the creation of groups and cultures considered heretics by Catholicism. Number 16. Crime increased. The famine led to an increase in crime throughout Europe. Even in traditionally peaceful and safe populations, the desperation for food pushed many to the limit. They did whatever it took to feed themselves and their families. Violence became part of the culture. The crisis had a profound impact on European society and its traditional values. In the decades following the famine, violence became more explicit and present in the daily lives of Europeans. Perhaps the greatest demonstration of this change was in the strategies of warfare during the 100 Years' War in the 14th century. The combats totally abandoned the conception of the knight, and had much more bloody confrontations before the nobles. They were more likely to have unfair or gambling confrontations than on the battlefield. The number of deaths due to war increased after this famine. Number 18. Governments lost confidence. The crisis of legitimacy. It affected all types of authorities, but especially the political and administrative ones. The population lost confidence and respect in the medieval governments that were unable to control and solve the famine. In the region, the greatest example is King Edward II, who was already an unpopular monarch. The famine was seen in England as a divine punishment against the monarch's evil reign. This eventually led to his fall from power. Number 19. A crisis resulting from climate change. The Great Famine was one of the most devastating experiences of climate change in human history. Before the famine, Europe experienced 4 centuries of unusually high temperatures, unusual for the region. This warm period led to an increase in population, agricultural production and fertile land. The drastic change in climate together with the heavy flooding that followed affected the land, the geography and also the demography. During the 4 warm centuries, the way of life and production had changed. In this region, climatic volatility worsened the basic problems of medieval Europe and marked human history with a devastating tragedy. Number 20. It stopped population growth. Naturally, the large number of deaths and diseases that occurred during the famine marked the end of the population growth experienced in Europe. During the warm period, the effects of the famine on the malnourished and most vulnerable survivors left a weak and unprepared population base to face other threats. Number 21. It was impossible to get rid of all the dead. The large number of starvation deaths and dead animals made burial of bodies a public health priority. It was impossible to fulfill the funeral rites for all the dead. The chronicles of the English city of Bristol state that the mortality rate in 1815 was so high that the survivors barely had time to bury the bodies. In fact, they began to eat horse and dog meat, and they had to do it instantly because there was no way to preserve it for emergencies. Number 22. Diseases arrived. The wet weather and heavy rains continued until the summer of 1317 when the usual weather patterns finally returned. It was possible to produce food again, but by that time the surviving population was particularly weakened and vulnerable. Not only because of famine but also because of various diseases that had epidemics in this period such as pneumonia, bronchitis and tuberculosis. Number 23. Desperation led to terrible actions. In such a serious and unavoidable emergency, the desperation of the population was total. So much so that chronicles of the time point out that there were families who abandoned their children in the forests to avoid the responsibility of feeding them. There were even reports of cannibalism during the period, although it is not known for sure if this happened or if they were just rumors due to the same concern of the population. Number 24. Famous stories were created during that time. You may find the idea of abandoning children to their fate surprising and even grotesque, but it's probably not the first time you've heard of it. Although you may not have paid attention before. Virtually everyone in the West is familiar with the story of the two children lost in the forest looking for food who are lured into an incredible house built of candy and run by an evil witch, whose goal is to fatten them up and devour them. We speak of course of Hansel and Gretel, a popular German tale believed to have originated during the 14th century. Number 25. A worse misfortune was to come. The worst part of the Great European Famine is that it was not the greatest tragedy of medieval Europe. This terrible period was but a prelude to the deadliest event of the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague epidemic that occurred between 1347 and 1351. It killed between 75 and 200 million people throughout Europe. This epidemic was so severe that it is believed to have killed between 30 and 60% of the European population. 1/3 of the population of the Middle East. In fact, it reduced the world population by 20% because of its terrible consequences and the physical manifestation of its symptoms. This terrible epidemic is remembered under the name of the Black Death. The Great Famine in Europe was one of the worst chapters of medieval history. In the West, a lethal combination of natural factors and social inequality led almost the entire region to a collapse difficult to repeat in the future. Although the official period of the Great Famine lasted until 1317, the entire European continent suffered its consequences. The region did not see signs of recovery until 4 years later in 1322. Of course, such a dramatic event was followed by other wars and smaller-scale famines, epidemics and diseases. We hope you found this video useful, and if you have anything to add, please share it with us in the comments section. Like this video and send the link to your family and best friends, so that they also know more of the 25 horrible things about the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 that almost wiped out Europe in the Middle Ages. If you are new to our channel, don't forget to subscribe. Remember, a people that does not know its history is condemned to repeat it. We'll be back soon with more curiosities from history.